Tuesday, the 4th of February, 1986, farmer John Rain rang the police to tell them that he discovered the naked body of a young lady in the boiler paddock of his farm. He said it looked as though she'd been murdered. Police rushed to the scene and found the body of nursing sister Anita Cobby, who'd been reported missing by her family the day before. Anita Cobby had been dragged through a barbed wire fence and punched, beaten, and kicked. There was extensive bruising on her head, breasts, face, shoulders, groin, thighs, and legs. Her throat had been cut, and she was almost decapitated. Medical officers believed that Anita Cobby was conscious when she had her throat cut. It would have taken 2 to 3 minutes for her to bleed to death. Anita Cobby had also been repeatedly raped. The only thing the police could accurately assume at the time of the discovery of the body was that more than one person, possibly a gang, had committed the crime. The murder of Anita Cobby united the public in outrage. Petitions with tens of thousands of signatures supporting the return of the death penalty were handed to the government of New South Wales. A Sydney TV station ran a phone-in poll that registered nearly 16,000 calls, almost 95% of which were in favor of the reintroduction of the death penalty. To a bewildered general public, it was inconceivable that the perpetrators of such a crime could be walking the streets, passing themselves off as normal human beings. But they were. 5 of them. A gang of spineless cowards who preyed on women and other people's properties between prison terms. Between them, they had over 50 convictions for offenses including larceny, illegal drug use, car theft, breaking and entering, armed robbery, escaping lawful custody, receiving stolen goods, assault, and non-consensual sex. Their leader was named John Raymond Travers. Although only 18, police believe that John Travers was responsible for the rape of at least a dozen men and women. He'd been in and out of institutions since he was 12 when he was arrested for using marijuana. He was an alcoholic at 14 and did as he pleased. His parents had no control over him at all. The eldest of 7 children, John Travers was raised in the working-class suburb of Mount Druitt in Sydney's Outer West. There are many hard-working families living at Mount Druitt, but the suburbs also had one of the highest rates of unemployment in the state. It's also among the top 5 suburbs for house break-ins and drug abuse. When his bus driver father Ken walked out, his mother Sharon couldn't cope. She stacked weight onto her once slim figure until she was in excess of 120 kilograms and couldn't even properly perform normal functions such as going to the toilet or taking a shower. As she got older and fatter, Sharon Travers spent more and more time in the hospital, being treated for a variety of ailments directly related to her eating habits. It was left to John to feed the family, and as he spent his welfare check on alcohol, he did this by stealing. The Travers household was filled with doom and despair. One thing John Travers liked doing was killing animals. He'd butcher the chickens and pigs that he stole and dress them for the family's table. He'd learned how to do this when he worked for a time at a local meat plant. He also liked having sex with animals. Many people had been witness to John Travers having intercourse with sheep, pigs, goats, chickens, and lambs. They claimed to have witnessed Travers sodomize a sheep, and as he was about to have an orgasm, he'd pull the unfortunate animal's head back and cut its throat. John Raymond Travers was covered in tattoos. He even had them on his penis. But the most noticeable tattoo was that of a teardrop under his left eye, which he thought made him look like a tough guy. But he was only tough when his gang, who'd bash and rape women and homosexuals at railway stations and public toilets, surrounded him. On his own, Travers was a coward. But to his half-witted followers, he was a fearless leader who instigated the sexual assaults and beatings. They got away with it time after time because their victims were terrified of the reprisals should they go to the police. But one victim did go to the police. In mid-1995, Travers and his gang bashed and raped a girl at Toongabbie, a few kilometers from Mount Druitt, and the victim gave police a full description of the man with the tattoo of a teardrop beneath his left eye. When Travers heard that the police wanted to have a chat with him, he and 3 of the gang fled to Western Australia until things cooled down. They settled in the seaside holiday town of Mandurah, about 60 kilometers south of Perth. It didn't take the local police long to notice the dirty-looking bunch of scruffs, led by the facially tattooed Travers as they drove around the town in their car with the New South Wales number plates. Travers started having an affair with a local 17-year-old homosexual and got one of his gang to take Polaroid photos of them having sex together. One night, when he was full of alcohol and drugs, Travers took the gang to his lover's house and raped and bashed the young man at knife point in front of them. Covered in his own blood from knife wounds and almost unable to walk from his injuries, the youth made it to the police station where he reported what had happened. Police rounded up 2 of the men, but Travers and the other gang member had fled. Back in Sydney, Travers proudly told a close family associate, who became known as Miss X, of the savage rape. He wrongfully thought that Miss X admired him. Many times in the past, he'd confided in her, and she always made out that she was fascinated with his stories. But Miss X had never breathed a word to anyone. She was terrified that John Travers would kill her if he found out. Travers went into great detail about the rape of the youth and produced the photos that the gang members had taken. He told Miss X that he wanted to slit the young man's throat at the moment of orgasm, just like he did to the sheep. He told Miss X how he'd kicked and beaten the youth after he'd raped him. Miss X was mortified. It was not a story that could be easily forgotten, and 8 months later, when she heard the stories of how Anita Cobby was murdered, she'd remember what John Travers had told her about the rape in Western Australia. One of Travers's faithful followers was another misfit named Michael Mick James Murdoch. Mick worshipped Travers. His mother, Rose Murdoch, hated the hold that Travers had over the boy and warned Mick repeatedly that Travers would only get him in jail. Travers and Mick Murdoch were the same age and had been inseparable since they were kids. They considered themselves to be blood brothers. They even looked alike and had the same hairstyles and wore the same clothes. They put tattoos on each other with a battery-operated kit. A standard joke among their friends was that if it was Murdoch who tattooed Travers's penis, then how did he get it erect to do it? There were inferences that they could have been more than just friends, but they denied it. Like Travers, Mick Murdoch came from a broken home and had been in trouble with the police since he was 12. His first conviction had been for smoking marijuana with Travers. At 33, Michael Mick Patrick Murphy was the oldest members of Travers's gang, but he was by no means the smartest. Serving 25 years in prison for 33 convictions of breaking and entering and burglary, his most recent escape attempt had been successful, and he hadn't even planned it. A situation arose where Murphy and another prisoner were put in a position of trust outside the gates of Silverwater Prison, and they decided to make a run for it. Mick Murphy had been on the run for 6 weeks at the time of the murder of Anita Cobby. Mick Murphy had spent about half of his life behind bars. The eldest of 9 children, Mick was expected to set an example for his younger brothers and sisters, but he fell afoul of the law early in his teens and was rarely out of prison in the years to come. Heavily tattooed like Travers, Mick Murphy was a thug who had no regard for anyone but himself. He was known throughout the western suburbs as a man to be avoided. 2 of Mick Murphy's younger brothers, Les and Gary Murphy, made up the remainder of Travers's gang. Both were known criminals. 4 years younger than Mick, Gary Stephen Murphy was a habitual criminal with an extensive record dating back to his early teens. His crimes included car theft, receiving stolen goods, breaking and entering, assault, and escaping lawful custody. Gary fancied himself as a fighter, was always brawling, and had been barred from most of the clubs and hotels in the district. Once he'd had one too many drinks, he'd look for a fight. Most times, he got more than he gave, much to the delight of the onlookers. The neighborhood was always pleased when the police came to take Gary Murphy away to prison. The youngest of the Murphy trio, 24-year-old Leslie Joseph, looked as though he couldn't hurt a fly. But like Mick and Gary, he had a fierce temper and couldn't keep his mouth shut, as a result of which someone or other was always giving him a belting. The skinny little criminal's record included many counts of theft, car stealing, and sexual intercourse without consent. It was common knowledge that Les didn't have much luck with the girls, and the only way he could get sex was to pay for it or get it by force. Always a tough guy when his burly mates were around, Les Murphy was frightened when he was on his own, and he lived on the reputation of brothers Gary and Mick. Like the rest of the gang, the tiny Les Murphy had spent much of his adult life behind bars. The brothers had seen more of each other behind bars than on the outside. When they weren't in prison, the Murphy brothers spent their time around the Blacktown and Mount Druitt area in Sydney's west. With Mick on the run and his two brothers recently released from prison, it was a rare occasion for the Murphy boys to be together in freedom. But that fateful night, on Sunday the 2nd of February 1986, the three Murphy brothers ganged up with Murdoch and Travers in a stolen car and went looking for a victim. They found Anita Cobby. As a policeman said later, she just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. 26-year-old Anita Lorraine Cobby was a nursing sister at Sydney Hospital. At one stage, she'd been a beauty pageant winner and was considered beautiful enough to become a professional model, but she chose to do nursing instead. Anita lived with her parents, Gary and Grace Lynch, in the modest family home at Blacktown, a working-class suburb about 40 kilometers west of the heart of Sydney. Gary Lynch had worked as a graphic artist with the Navy until his retirement a couple of years earlier. His wife, Grace, had been a nursing sister and still did the occasional casual shift at the local hospital to help them in their retirement. As well as Anita, the Lynches had another daughter, Catherine, aged 21. Both girls were more than any loving parent could wish for. They were good at school, never stayed out late, and loved the beach and outdoors. There was never so much as a hint of drug or alcohol problems. The Lynch family would spend most of their spare time together on family outings. They shared their love of music and sports and spent their holidays boating together on the nearby Nepean River. Anita was a good student and very popular with her classmates at Evans High School at Blacktown. When she was 20, a family friend persuaded her to enter a Miss Australia beauty contest to raise money for the Spastic Centre. The Lynches turned it into a family affair and worked tirelessly selling raffle tickets at local shopping centres. They raised $10,000 and Anita was crowned as Miss Western Suburbs Charity Queen. Photos of the tall beauty with her dark curly hair, infectious smile, and wide eyes appeared in all the newspapers. She became an overnight celebrity. But Anita Lynch did not want to be in the spotlight. She could have pursued a glamorous life on the catwalk, but to her parents' absolute delight, she applied for a position as a trainee nurse at Sydney Hospital. She was accepted and went on to become a sister. Anita was so good at her work that she was accepted as a sister in the highly specialized field of microsurgery. While at Sydney Hospital, Anita Lynch fell in love with John Cobby, a handsome young nursing student 3 years her senior. John and Anita were inseparable. They shared the same interests in movies and music, and they studied together. Anita's parents liked John, and when the couple became engaged, they agreed that their daughter had made a good choice. Anita and John Cobby were married in a church ceremony in March 1982. Over the next 3 years, they traveled extensively overseas and lived and worked for a time at Coffs Harbour on the New South Wales north coast. They returned to Sydney in 1985, and within a matter of months, the marriage was inexplicably over. Anita went home to live with her parents in Blacktown. The young couple kept their marital problems to themselves, but it was obvious that they were both deeply distressed by the breakup. They kept in touch constantly by phone, but they did not get back together. Anita Cobby had no trouble getting her old job back at Sydney Hospital. She threw herself into her work to forget the heartache of her broken marriage, spending most of her time at the hospital and in the company of her work colleagues. Sister Cobby didn't mind what hours she worked. When she was working late at night, she'd ring her father from Blacktown Station and he'd come and pick her up. It wouldn't matter if Gary Lynch was in bed asleep. He'd still find the time to collect Anita. Why Anita didn't ring for her father to collect her on that fateful Sunday night but chose to walk home will remain a mystery that can never be answered. After work, at 5:30 on the afternoon of Sunday the 2nd of February 1986, Anita Cobby and two nursing sister friends went to a Lebanese restaurant in Redfern for an early dinner. Lynn Bradshaw and Elaine Bray had done their training with Anita, and they'd all been friends for years. They shared some wine, and Lynn dropped Anita off at Central Railway Station to catch the train home. Both of her friends offered to put Anita up for the night, but she declined their offers, said goodnight, and walked up the ramp to the station. Except for her murderers, that was the last time that anyone could recall seeing Anita Cobby alive. When his daughter didn't call that night, Gary Lynch wasn't concerned. Anita often got caught late at work and stayed overnight with workmates in the city. She was a sensible, responsible woman, and there was no reason in the world for Gary Lynch to be worried. When the duty sister from the Sydney Hospital rang early in the afternoon wondering why Sister Cobby hadn't turned up for work, Mr. Lynch suggested that they try her friends' homes. He was told that her friends were already at work and they were concerned as well. Gary Lynch started to worry. He rang his wife at work. No, she had heard nothing. Mr. Lynch rang every place that his daughter was likely to be. By late afternoon, he decided to report his daughter missing to Blacktown Police, and by the following day, the Lynch family was frantic. John Cobby had joined the search, and every hospital, friend, and working colleague was checked. Nothing. All the family could do now was wait and pray that Anita would walk through the door. What the tough homicide detectives saw in the boiler paddock on John Reen's farm that day will live with them forever. John Reen told them that his cows had been acting suspiciously and were milling around an object on the ground when he left his property in the morning. When he returned, they were still in the same circle, and he decided to investigate. Loud yelling and screaming from the paddock had woken him on that Sunday night. The boiler paddock, which is a fair distance from the Reen farmhouse, is so named because John Reen kept all of his old cows, the boilers, in it. The paddock runs alongside Reen Road, in Prospect, a rural suburb only a few minutes' drive from Blacktown Station. Anita Cobby's body was discovered about 100 meters in from the fence. It appeared that her murderers had dragged her through the barbed wire fence into the paddock. Since Reen Road is a notorious lover's lane, a car parked alongside the boiler paddock on Sunday night would not have been unusual. When Detective Sergeant Kennedy and Detective Constable Heskett knocked on the Lynch's door that day, Grace and Gary Lynch instinctively feared the worst. The policeman told them that they'd found the body of a young lady in a paddock at Prospect. The body answered the description of their missing daughter. Sergeant Kennedy showed Mr. and Mrs. Lynch a wedding ring that they identified as being similar to the one that their daughter wore. The detectives asked Gary Lynch to accompany them to the morgue to identify his daughter. The detectives supported the sobbing Mr. Lynch as he said goodbye to his daughter for the last time. The detectives knew that they could not rest until Anita Cobby's murderers were brought to justice. Two local detectives, Senior Constable Kevin Rowe and Detective Sergeant Graham Rosetta, were called in. Both were tough street cops who knew the area backward. From that moment on, John Travers and his gang of savages didn't stand a chance. If it took the rest of their lives, Detective Kennedy and his team weren't going to let them get away. A task force was set up at Blacktown Police Station. Journalists reported the extent of the atrocities to their editors, but the full facts of what happened to Anita Cobby were never printed in any newspaper. Mirror police reporter Joe Morris recalled the night. "We sat around all night waiting for a scoop," he said, "but they wouldn't let us past the front desk to have a chat with the detectives. As more information about the killing filtered through, we just stood around in disbelief. I've covered a lot of shocking cases over the years, and I thought that I'd seen and heard it all, but the horror of what I heard that night will live with me forever." Police had little to go on. A thorough search of the boiler paddock revealed nothing. Although her body was naked, none of Anita Cobby's clothes were found. There was no murder weapon, no motive, and no reason for Anita Cobby to be in the paddock at the time of her murder. She had no enemies and was not involved with criminals or drug dealers. There was no secret lover or married man in her life. Anita Cobby was the epitome of respectability. Police kept running into brick walls. They investigated the noises that Mr. Reen had heard, but got nowhere. Reen Road was popular with lovers and with joyriders. The noises could have come from anyone. The task force started the long job of checking out the hundreds of local criminals. Sex offenders received special attention, but again, the police drew a blank. Detectives interviewed the two friends with whom Anita had spent her last hours. At this stage, no one was even sure that Anita Cobby had caught the train to Blacktown that night. Then, the first lead came in. Residents of Newton Road, a few hundred meters from the Blacktown railway station, reported seeing a girl being dragged into a car on Sunday night. She was screaming. They rang the police and gave the description of the car as a gray and white Holden Kingswood sedan. Uniformed police had investigated the call, but a search of the area had revealed nothing. The witnesses to the abduction told detectives that at 9:50 p.m. they heard a loud scream and ran outside. They saw a man with his legs sticking out of the open door of a Holden car. A dark-haired woman was struggling violently and screaming as the man dragged her into the car. They could still hear the woman screaming as the car drove away with its lights off. Two of the witnesses, Linda and John McGaughy, were horrified at what they saw. When their brother Paul and his girlfriend Lorraine Busher arrived home a few minutes later, they gave them a description of the car, and then Paul and Lorraine went looking for it. One of the places Paul McGaughy checked was the notorious Reen Road, a couple of minute drive from where the girl was abducted. About halfway down Reen Road, they passed an empty gray 1970 model HJ Holden. They thought nothing of it as the description of the car they were given was of a Holden Kingswood. They searched the area and other likely spots for 2 hours before returning home. Although they still hadn't confirmed that Anita Cobby had actually caught the train home to Blacktown, police had to assume that the reported abduction was that of the murdered woman. It fitted into the time that she would have arrived at Blacktown. But why didn't she ring her father to pick her up? Or why didn't she catch a taxi? Police were working around the clock. They returned to the boiler paddock at night to give them a feel of what may have happened. Hundreds of cadet police were called in to search the paddock, but it proved fruitless. The public support was overwhelming. Hundreds of calls flooded into task force headquarters, and every call was treated seriously and followed up. 2 days after the discovery of Anita Cobby's body, the New South Wales government posted a $50,000 reward for information leading to the capture of her killers. The phones ran hot, but all of the exhausting follow-ups came to nothing. By now, police weren't sure that the woman abducted in Newton Road was Anita Cobby. Maybe Anita had caught a taxi and had been murdered by the driver. They checked out every cab driver in the district. The following Sunday, 1 week after the murder, a policewoman reenacted the movements of Anita Cobby on the last night of her life in the hope that it may jog someone's memory. Constable Debbie Wallace wore similar clothes to those worn by Anita on that night and boarded the 9:12 p.m. train to Blacktown. As she walked the length of the train, detectives interviewed the passengers and showed them photos of the murdered woman. From Blacktown Station, Constable Wallace set out on foot for the half-hour walk to the Lynch family home on Sullivan Street. Police followed in an unmarked car. A couple of cars pulled up and offered the long-legged policewoman a lift, but they weren't the killers of Anita Cobby. Again, the police drew a blank. On Tuesday, the 11th of February, police had their first major breakthrough when a member of the public ran to say he represented 4 citizens who had information about the murder but were too frightened to come forward. The man met with police and told them that a man named John Travers and 2 other criminals, Mick Murdoch and Les Murphy, had stolen a car a couple of days before the murder and had resprayed it gray. They'd taken the mag wheels from the stolen car and replaced them with normal ones. The informant told the detectives that Travers had a reputation for extreme violence and carried a knife. The citizens were terrified that if the information amounted to nothing, then Travers and his gang would come after them. As it happened, Travers' name had come up several times already. The police had been told that John Travers was capable of murder, but they'd been unable to locate him. Local police had wanted to talk with them about a rape at nearby Toongabbie 8 months earlier. The victim of the assault had told police that the leader of the pack had a tattoo of a teardrop beneath his left eye, but Travers and his mates had cleared out to Western Australia. At last, the police believed that they were on the right track. Very discreetly, they started checking Travers' known haunts. They told no one of the lead for fear that Travers and his gang would get wind of it and disappear, but they needed more information. By this time, the state government had doubled the reward to $100,000. With this carrot dangling under his nose, an informant came to light with some addresses where John Travers may be. In a dawn raid on a house in nearby Wentworthville, police found John Travers and Mick Murdoch in bed together. They admitted that they stole the car, but denied any knowledge of the murder of Anita Cobby. Police found a blood-stained sheath knife that belonged to Travers. Asked where the stains were from, Travers said that he'd slaughtered a sheep with it. At the same time as the arrest of Travers and Murdoch, police had picked up Les Murphy on another raid on a house in Doonside, about 3 kilometers away. On Les Murphy's Holden station wagon were the mag wheels and sheepskin seat covers from the stolen car. Murphy admitted being involved in stealing the car, but also denied any involvement in the death of Anita Cobby. Les Murphy and Mick Murdoch were charged with car theft and released on bail. Police put a tail on both of them, hoping that Murphy and Murdoch would lead them to the stolen car. It was their most vital piece of evidence, as it was likely to provide the fingerprints, blood samples, and clothing that police needed to tie the abduction in Newton Road to the murder and to the Travers gang. John Travers was held on suspicion of having committed numerous sex offenses in the area. These included the rape of a young girl at Toongabbie 8 months earlier. Police grilled Travers about the Cobby murder, but he admitted nothing. They knew that without the stolen car or confession, they didn't have a case. Travers asked if he could have a visitor. He gave police the number of Miss X, the woman he'd confided in about the rape of the boy in Perth some months earlier. When Detective Kevin Rowe rang Miss X and told her that Travers wanted her to bring him some cigarettes, she told him exactly what he'd wanted to hear. Miss X had a lot to tell the police about John Travers, and they arranged to meet in a public place that afternoon. When they met, Miss X, an ex-heroin addict, explained that she was terrified of being caught talking to the police. Even though Travers was in custody, she still feared for her life. Miss X told of the rape in Western Australia and of another rape that Travers had told her about. She said that in both cases, Travers had spoken of using the knife on his victims in a manner similar to that actually used on Anita Cobby. There was no doubt in Miss X's mind that John Travers was their man, and she agreed to help police trap Travers. She'd ask him if he knew anything about the murder and report back to the police. The following morning, Miss X arrived with cigarettes for John Travers and was left in private with the prisoner for half an hour. When she returned to the muster room, she was pale and distraught and shaking like a leaf. She collapsed in tears and told them that Travers had just told her that he'd murdered Anita Cobby. Miss X made a statement about what Travers had just told her and agreed to visit him again the following morning. This time, Miss X would be fitted with a tape recorder. Travers told all. He boasted about how they'd grabbed Anita Cobby and how they'd raped and bashed her until Travers finally cut her throat. Miss X found it difficult to contain her emotion as Travers told of the night of the 2nd of February. Police had no trouble in rounding up Mick Murdoch and Les Murphy. They'd been keeping tabs on them since they were let out on bail. Murdoch was at home. Les Murphy was found hiding between 2 women under a blanket. One of the women was pregnant. Murdoch and Murphy cried and blamed John Travers as they confessed to the police. Travers was dragged out of his cell and, in light of the allegations made against him by Murdoch and Murphy, made a confession in which he named everyone involved. He made no attempt to deny that he was the one who actually killed Anita Cobby. He was proud of it. Police informed the media that 3 men had been charged with the abduction and murder of Anita Cobby. Hundreds of people turned up at the Blacktown police station to vent their opinions as to what should be done with them. "Hang the bastards! Give them to us for a minute," the angry mob yelled. As they were driven from the police station to be formally charged at the Blacktown local court, people spat on the cars and called for the prisoners to show their faces. When the 3 cars had left for the court, there was applause and cheers for the police. It was 22 days since Anita Cobby had been murdered. Now the hunt was on for Gary and Mick Murphy. The newspapers published descriptions and photos of the wanted men and warned the public that they were extremely dangerous and were not to be approached under any circumstances. Police followed every lead and raided houses all over the western suburbs, but the pair eluded them. Then a man called to say that 2 men answering the description of the wanted Murphy brothers were living in the townhouse next to him. Police concentrated their efforts on a block of townhouses in Terry Way in the southern Sydney suburb of Glenfield, about 22 kilometers south of Blacktown. They surrounded the block and waited. When a woman came out, police grabbed her, and when she was out of sight of the building, she told them that the Murphy brothers had been there during the day but had left. The police didn't believe her. They decided to go in. With Polaire, the police helicopter, flooding the area with its searchlights, police smashed the door to the townhouse down and arrested Mick and Gary Murphy. Mick was sitting down watching TV and offered no resistance. Gary Murphy ran into a wall of police as he fled out the back door. One of the pursuing officers tackled him, and the pair went sliding into a fence, scratching Gary Murphy's face. He'd claim later that the police bashed him. They hadn't. Gary Murphy was so frightened that he wet his pants. The brothers were taken back to Blacktown Police Station and charged with the murder of Anita Cobby. Word of the arrest spread like wildfire, and an angry crowd gathered around the police station once more, calling for blood. As many as 1,500 people blocked the streets around the station, waiting for a glimpse of the killers. At 9 a.m., the Murphy brothers were formally charged at Blacktown Court. Armed Tactical Response Group police manned all vantage points in case the mob took matters into their own hands. At their committal hearing in July 1986, it was found that all 5 accused had a case to answer. In spite of their confessions and the overwhelming evidence, all had elected to plead not guilty. Their trial, held in March 1987, started in sensation. Minutes before the proceedings began, John Travers changed his plea to guilty. He admitted that he was the one who murdered Anita Cobby and would take what was coming to him. The following morning, there was another sensation when the trial was aborted after a leading newspaper published the fact that Mick Murphy was an escapee at the time of the murder. It was decided that the suggestion that he'd been in jail and had a criminal record could prejudice the jury and deny him a fair trial. The jury was dismissed, and a new trial date was set for a week later. During the 54-day trial, the jury heard evidence from dozens of witnesses, but it was the words of the accused and their own records of the interview that would be their undoing. Each statement varied from the others, but they were unified in 3 things: that the police had beaten the statements out of them and they were forced to sign them under threat of death, that their individual part in the crime was minimal and it was the others who committed the atrocities, and that it was John Travers who had cut Anita Cobby's throat. From the 5 statements of the accused, the jury heard what really happened on that awful night on Sunday the 2nd of February 1986. Travers and his gang had spent most of the Sunday afternoon and evening drinking at the Duneside Hotel, and they were all pretty drunk. They decided to go for a drive in the car that Travers had stolen a week earlier and steal a woman's bag for gasoline money. The lone woman walking down Newton Road with her bag slung over her shoulder was the perfect target. They stopped the car in front of Anita Cobby, and Travers and Mick Murdoch jumped out and dragged her in. They told police later that there was no particular reason for choosing Anita Cobby. She just happened to be there at the time, and John Travers wanted her. Within seconds of being in the car, Anita was ordered to take her clothes off, but she refused. She repeatedly told her assailants, "Leave me alone, I'm married." Travers and Murdoch started ripping her clothes off and punching her in the face and about the back of the head. Les Murphy leaned over from the front seat and punched Anita in the face, while Michael Murphy slapped her. Anita put up a violent struggle, but she had no chance against the gang. They held their nude hostage on the floor of the back of the car while they pulled into a garage to get gasoline with money stolen from Anita's purse. On the way from the garage to Reen Road, Travers and Mick Murphy raped Anita at knife point in the back seat while the others examined the contents of her bag. Halfway down Reen Road, they stopped the car and threw their naked victim into a ditch, where John Travers, Gary Murphy, and Les Murphy took turns raping her. Gary Murphy forced Anita to perform oral sex on him. The 5 men then picked the semi-conscious Anita up and dragged her through the barbed wire fence, causing long, deep cuts to her flesh. The sobbing young woman could offer little resistance. She'd been so badly battered and kicked that she could barely walk. The gang carried and dragged her to the middle of the boiler paddock and threw her to the ground. As Anita begged and pleaded to be let go, Mick Murdoch raped her again while Michael Murphy forced her to have oral sex with him. After they'd finished, Les Murphy sodomized Anita. While Travers raped her again, Gary Murphy and Mick Murdoch tried to force Anita to have oral sex with them both at the same time, but they couldn't get erections. Then Michael Murphy went berserk and raped, bashed, and kicked Anita until she just lay on the ground, hardly conscious and breathing in gasps. Les Murphy gave Anita one final kick in the head before they decided that they'd had enough. They left their victim in the paddock and headed back to the car. But Travers wasn't happy. He claimed that Anita would be able to recognize all of them and that she'd heard them call each other by name. She had to die. "I'm going to go back and kill her," Travers said. "She'll never live to get us up. I'll slit her throat." Rather than try and stop him, the gang urged Travers on. "Yeah, she'll see us all in the shit. Go on, go back and do it." Not needing much encouragement, Travers returned to Anita, sat on her back, lifted her head back by the hair, and cut her throat. It was not unlike what he'd done to the sheep in his backyard. In his statement, Travers recalled that he thought he'd cut Anita's throat twice. Forensic evidence indicated that he had. Travers left Anita Cobby lying semi-conscious in the paddock, bleeding to death with her head almost severed from her body. When Travers returned to the car, he was covered in Anita Cobby's blood and boasted about what he'd done. In his statement, Michael Murdoch said he asked Travers what it was like to kill someone. He replied, "It didn't feel like nothing. I didn't feel anything at all." They decided to return to Travers' mother's house and clean up. During the short trip, Travers went into great detail about the killing. They all laughed and told him how clever he was. Not one of the murderers had a twinge of conscience about what they'd done. Rather, they joked about the night's events until they reached the house. Travers explained away the blood on his clothes by telling his mother that they'd killed a dog that had barked at them. Mick Murdoch gathered up all of Anita Cobby's belongings from the car, and the gang stood around and drank beer as they burned the evidence in the backyard. 5 days later, they took the stolen car to a deserted clearing in the bush and set fire to it. In their unsworn statements from the dock, Gary, Les, and Mick Murphy and Mick Murdoch all minimized their involvement in the last hour of the life of Anita Cobby. They all blamed each other. They all said the police had bashed them with torches and fists and forced the confessions out of them. Only Travers had admitted his guilt. Each of them tried to unload as much of the blame as possible onto him. Gary Murphy claimed that he wasn't even there that night. He was drinking with friends, he said, but he couldn't remember exactly where. Les Murphy broke down and cried, then asked God to help make the jury believe that he didn't bash and rape Anita Cobby. Michael Murphy claimed that he only went along for the ride and that he was the only one who tried to stop them from dragging Anita Cobby into the car. At one stage, he cried out, "I'm innocent. This is giving me the shits." Mick Murdoch claimed that he was shocked by the whole affair and he sat in the car and played no part. On the 10th of June 1987, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all 4 men after a 9-hour deliberation. Mick Murdoch and the 3 Murphy brothers showed little emotion as they were led from the court. The week between their conviction and their sentencing was not a good one for the gang. Convicts do not approve of such behavior. There's a code among men in prisons. Child molesters and packs of men who rape and murder young women are at the top of the hit list. They're referred to as rock spiders. Every one of Travers' gang was attacked and beaten by other prisoners. On the 16th of June 1987, John Travers and his gang were sentenced in the Supreme Court. Hundreds of people had queued for hours to hear the sentence. Justice Maxwell did nothing to hide his contempt as he addressed the 5 murderers standing before him. There's no doubt that apart from the humiliation, the degradation and terror inflicted upon this young woman, she was the victim of a prolonged and sadistic physical and sexual assault. Wild animals are given to pack assaults and killings. This is one of the most, if not the most, horrifying physical and sexual assaults I've encountered in my 40-odd years associated with the law. The crime is exacerbated by the fact that the victim almost certainly was made aware, in the end, of her pending death. Throughout the long trial, the prisoners, albeit to a lesser degree in the case of the prisoner Murdoch, showed no signs of remorse or contrition. Instead, frequently they were observed to be laughing with one another and were seen sniggering behind their hands. Justice Maxwell then sentenced each man to life imprisonment and added, "The circumstances of the murder of Mrs. Anita Lorraine Cobby prompt me to recommend that the official files of each prisoner should be clearly marked never to be released. If the executive deems it proper in the future to consider their files, then I would echo the advice proffered, in the case of which the facts were not entirely dissimilar, by a former and distinguished chief judge at common law, that the executive should grant to the prisoners the same degree of mercy that they bestowed upon Anita Lorraine Cobby in the Boiler Paddock, Prospect, on the night of the 2nd of February, 1986. I do not think that the community would expect otherwise." John Raymond Travers, Michael James Murdoch, Leslie Joseph Murphy, Michael Patrick Murphy, and Gary Stephen Murphy are in maximum security in the toughest prisons throughout New South Wales. And there they will die. They are never to be released. Michael Murphy passed away in prison due to complications of chronic viral liver disease. He was in custody at Long Bay Correctional Centre in Malabar, New South Wales, before he died aged 66 on February 21, 2020. Murphy had been transferred to Long Bay Hospital for palliative care due to deteriorating health before his death. The post-mortem conducted by pathologist Rebecca Irvine confirmed that he died from complications of chronic viral liver disease.